The wind howled across the narrow plain where mountains pressed against the sea, and the chill salt air carried with it the scent of destiny. It was here, on the rocky shores of southern Anatolia, that two worlds collided in a clash so monumental it would echo through centuries. The story of Issus is not merely the record of a battle, it is the moment when ambition, courage, and strategy aligned against overwhelming numbers, and the fate of East and West hung in a fragile balance. What drove a young Macedonian king, barely in his 20s, to face the full might of the Persian Empire? And what compelled tens of thousands of men to march into the jaws of death for his cause? To understand Issus, we must journey back to a time when the world seemed divided between two poles: the sprawling empire of Persia under Darius III and the rising force of Macedon under Alexander the Great. After his father Philip II had unified the fractious Greek city-states, Alexander inherited not only a throne but a mission. Philip had envisioned the conquest of Persia as the crowning achievement of his reign, but assassination ended that dream abruptly. In 336 BCE, the young Alexander found himself king, burdened with the weight of his father's ambition and the skepticism of seasoned generals who doubted his youth. Yet in less than 2 years, Alexander had crushed internal revolts, secured the loyalty of Greece, and launched an audacious invasion across the Hellespont into Asia Minor. At the Granicus River, his first clash with the Persians, he proved his mettle, defeating a satrapal army and carving open the gateway into Asia. But the Persians were not yet vanquished. Darius III, the great king himself, would now take the field to restore his empire's honor. The stage was set for a confrontation unlike any the Greeks had ever faced. Issus was not chosen by Alexander. Fate, or perhaps divine will, brought the armies together in a narrow bottleneck of land hemmed in by the mountains of Cilicia and the waters of the Mediterranean. Darius had hoped to overwhelm his enemy with sheer numbers, for his host was said to number more than 100,000, Persian nobles, levies from across the empire, cavalry from the highlands, and contingents from the distant east. Against them stood Alexander's hardened force of some 40,000 men, Macedonian phalanxes, loyal cavalry companions, and Greek mercenaries whose discipline and training compensated for their fewer numbers. The imbalance seemed absurd, almost laughable. Yet the terrain would betray the Persians, and Alexander's genius would turn disadvantage into triumph. The encounter began not in the clash of arms, but in the movements of armies across landscapes. Alexander had marched south through Cilicia, his troops weary from illness and the harsh climate, while Darius, with his massive force, attempted to outmaneuver him. Instead of facing Alexander in the open plains of Syria, where his cavalry and numbers could dominate, Darius advanced into the narrow confines of Cilicia, cutting off Alexander's supply line and placing his army behind the Macedonian advance. Suddenly, the hunter became the hunted. The Greeks were trapped between mountain and sea with a vast enemy host blocking their path. To any rational observer, Alexander's position was hopeless. Yet rather than retreat, he seized the moment. "At last," he is said to have exclaimed, "the great king comes to us where the numbers of his men will count for nothing." What followed was not only a battle of spears and shields, but of wills. Darius, encamped on the Pinarus River near the town of Issus, drew up his vast array in a formation that stretched across the narrow plain. His Greek mercenaries, some of the finest soldiers in his service, held the center, while his cavalry massed on the flanks. Behind them, the King of Kings himself stood in a magnificent chariot, surrounded by royal guards and courtiers, a vision of imperial splendor meant to awe friend and foe alike. To the Persians, this was more than war. It was the assertion of universal dominion, a demonstration that their king was the master of the known world. Against such grandeur, Alexander mustered his veterans in silence, their bronze armor glinting in the fading sun, their sarissas bristling like a forest of spears. These men had marched with him through river crossings and mountain passes. They trusted their king not because he claimed divinity, but because he bled beside them, led from the front, and shared their hardships. As the two armies prepared, the tension grew almost unbearable. The Pinarus River, shallow yet steep-banked, formed a natural defensive line for the Persians. Any attempt to cross would expose the Greeks to withering missile fire and counterattack, yet Alexander did not hesitate. He placed his phalanx at the center, the long spears of the Macedonians forming a bristling wall, while he personally took command of the cavalry on the right flank. His strategy was simple yet audacious. He would hold the Persians in the center, absorb their weight, and then deliver a decisive strike against Darius's position. To achieve this, he angled his right wing forward, drawing the enemy into imbalance and opening the way for a thunderous charge. The moment came suddenly. Trumpets blared, the earth trembled under the march of thousands of feet, and the Battle of Issus was joined. Macedonian phalangites surged forward into the river, shields raised against a hail of arrows and javelins. The clash was brutal, spear tips splintering, men dragged under the crush of bodies, screams echoing across the narrow plain. For a time, the Persians held firm, their mercenaries fighting with disciplined ferocity, their archers and slingers raining missiles on the advancing Greeks. Yet Alexander, at the head of his companion cavalry, did not falter. He spurred his horse into the river, his men following, and hurled themselves at the Persian left, where the royal guard stood. The impact was devastating. The Macedonian wedge cut deep, punching through lines and driving straight toward the chariot of Darius himself. Panic spread like wildfire. The sight of Alexander, helmet plumed, eyes burning with determination, leading a charge directly toward the Persian king, shook the resolve of even the bravest warriors. Darius, sensing the danger, turned his chariot and fled, his royal guard struggling to protect him. In an instant, the vast Persian host, once so confident, dissolved into chaos. Soldiers trampled one another in their rush to escape, cavalry wheeled aimlessly, and the cry of retreat drowned out the clash of battle. The rout was complete. What had begun as a contest of numbers ended as a triumph of will and genius. Alexander had seized the moment, exploited the terrain, and struck at the very heart of his enemy. Yet the significance of Issus lay not only in the victory itself but in its consequences. With Darius fleeing eastward, his camp fell into Macedonian hands. Among the spoils were not only treasures of immense value, but also the family of the Persian king, his mother, wife, and children captured alive. It was here that Alexander's character shone as brightly as his sword. Rather than treating them as mere prisoners, he showed them respect, addressing them with honor and preserving their dignity. To the Greeks, this magnanimity displayed the nobility of their king. To the Persians, it was a message that Alexander was not a barbarian conqueror, but a ruler who might one day sit upon the throne of Asia. In the wake of Issus, the world shifted. Persia, once seen as invincible, had been humbled. The myth of its supremacy shattered, and cities across the empire began to look upon Alexander not as an invader, but as a liberator. For the young Macedonian king, Issus was proof that his destiny was no mere dream. The gods, it seemed, walked with him, and yet, this was but one step on a path that would lead deeper into Asia, toward the burning heart of the Persian Empire itself. But before marching on, let us pause and consider the human element of this story. For beneath the grand strategies and sweeping movements of history were men of flesh and blood. The Greek soldier who crossed the Pinarus did so with no certainty of survival, only the trust that his king's courage would carry him through. The Persian archer who loosed his arrows into the advancing phalanx did so believing he fought for the greatest empire on earth. And Darius, the king of kings, fled not out of cowardice alone, but from the unbearable weight of knowing that the eyes of thousands watched his every move. Issus was as much a test of human spirit as it was of arms, and in this crucible Alexander emerged not just victorious, but legendary. The battlefield, when the din of war had ceased, was a vision of carnage and ruin. The narrow plain was littered with broken spears and shattered shields, the cries of the wounded echoing through the night as the cold sea breeze swept across the dead. Thousands of Persian soldiers lay where they had fallen, their lives extinguished in a single day of chaos. Horses, pierced and mangled, collapsed beside their riders, and scattered among them were the corpses of mercenaries Greeks who had chosen to fight for Persian gold rather than Macedonian glory. Men who found themselves cut down by their own countrymen in a bitter clash that blurred the lines between loyalty and betrayal. For the survivors, the image of that slaughter burned into memory, a reminder of how swiftly fortune could reverse in war. Alexander himself walked among the dead, his armor stained, his face streaked with sweat and dust. He had risked everything on the field of Issus, gambling not only his army, but the fragile dream of conquest that had carried him across the sea. Had he failed, there would have been no retreat, no second chance. The Persian host would have annihilated him, and the story of Alexander the Great would have ended before it truly began. Victory, then, was not just triumph, it was survival. And Alexander knew that this survival was owed not only to his own daring, but to the discipline and resilience of the men who had followed him without hesitation into the jaws of a colossal enemy. In the Persian camp, seized by the Macedonians in the hours after the rout, Alexander encountered the spoils of an empire. Gold, silver, and treasures of the East glittered under the torchlight, but greater than wealth were the human prizes, the royal family of Darius III. His mother, Sisygambis, his wife, Statera, and his young children had all fallen into Alexander's hands. The women, believing themselves at the mercy of a brutal conqueror, wept in fear, certain that dishonor or death awaited them. Yet what transpired instead became one of the most enduring legends of Alexander's character. Entering the tent, the young king reassured them that they would be treated with respect. He called Sisygambis mother, honoring her as though she were his own, and he refused to violate the dignity of Statera, treating her not as a captive, but as a queen. In this, Alexander displayed a magnanimity that contrasted sharply with the violence of the battlefield, winning admiration even from his enemies. Persian chroniclers, though loath to praise the Macedonian, could not deny the nobility of this act. To Alexander, it was more than kindness. It was a statement. He was not merely a destroyer, but a ruler in waiting, a man destined to inherit the empire he fought to conquer. Darius, meanwhile, fled eastward in disgrace, his chariot abandoned, his army shattered. He sent desperate letters to Alexander, offering ransom for his family, even proposing to cede lands west of the Euphrates in exchange for peace. But Alexander rejected these terms with a sharpness that revealed the scope of his ambition. He would not accept half an empire. He would not rest content with the title of victor in Asia Minor. His eyes were fixed upon the throne of Persia itself. "The earth cannot hold two suns," he is said to have replied, "nor Asia two kings." This defiance signaled to the world that the Macedonian was not a mere invader seeking plunder, but a conqueror intent on remaking the balance of power across continents. In Greece, news of the victory spread like wildfire. The cities that had once viewed Macedon with suspicion now saw Alexander as the champion of Hellenism, the avenger of past wrongs, the heir to centuries of struggle between East and West. Memories of the Persian invasions under Xerxes and Darius III lingered still in the collective memory, stories of Thermopylae and Salamis handed down as cautionary tales of foreign oppression. Now a new Alexander had arisen, carrying the torch of Greek vengeance into the very heart of Asia. Issus was painted not only as a military triumph, but as a moral one, a clash of civilization against despotism, of freedom against tyranny. The narrative was shaped carefully, for Alexander understood that victory on the battlefield must be matched by victory in the realm of myth. The battle was immortalized almost immediately. Artists and chroniclers seized upon the image of Alexander charging into the fray, his spear aimed at the Persian king, his horse leaping forward with divine vigor. In later centuries, the famous Alexander mosaic, discovered in Pompeii, would depict this very scene. Alexander, bareheaded, eyes burning, driving into the Persian line, while Darius, wide-eyed with terror, stretched out his hand in despair. The mosaic was not merely art, it was propaganda crystallized into image, a frozen moment of triumph that elevated Alexander to the level of a hero from Homeric legend. To his followers, he was no longer just a king. He was Achilles reborn, favored of the gods, chosen to alter the course of history. Yet beneath the triumph lay a deeper consequence. Issus shattered the illusion of Persian invincibility. For generations, the empire had seemed an immovable colossus, a dominion stretching from the Aegean to the Indus, bound together by the authority of the great king. But at Issus, this colossus faltered. If one man with a small but disciplined army could scatter its legions and send its king fleeing in terror, then perhaps the empire was not eternal after all. The psychological impact was immense. Satraps and cities began to waver in their loyalty. The myth of Persian supremacy was broken, and with it, the door to further conquest swung wide open. For Alexander, the victory also confirmed what he already believed, that he was guided by destiny. From childhood, he had been taught to see himself as set apart, touched by the divine. His mother Olympias whispered of his descent from Zeus himself. His tutor, Aristotle, had instilled in him a vision of the world as a stage upon which he was destined to play the central role. At Issus, these lessons crystallized into certainty. To lead a small army against overwhelming odds and emerge victorious was proof in his eyes that the gods favored his cause. He began to cultivate this image consciously, presenting himself not merely as a Macedonian king, but as the chosen conqueror of the known world. This self-belief, fused with political calculation, would propel him ever deeper into Asia. But Issus was not the end. It was only the beginning of a far greater struggle. The Persians, though defeated, were not destroyed. Darius still commanded vast resources, vast armies, and the loyalty of countless provinces. He would not yield his empire so easily. The road ahead for Alexander would be long, winding through sieges, deserts, and yet more colossal battles. Issus was a triumph, yes, but also a declaration of war on a scale the world had never before witnessed. By defeating Darius in Cilicia, Alexander had bound himself to a destiny that would drive him to the banks of the Euphrates, the plains of Gaugamela, and ultimately to the edge of the known world. Still, as the army rested in the aftermath, there was time for reflection. Around campfires, soldiers recounted the ferocity of the battle, the moment when the Persians broke, the sight of their king fleeing in shame. They told tales of Alexander's brilliance, of how he seemed to fight not with human strength alone, but with divine inspiration. These stories, whispered in the night, spread outward with each new town and each new people they encountered, weaving a legend that grew with every retelling. In such stories, Issus was not merely a military engagement. It was an epic, a turning point ordained by fate. The truth, of course, was more complex. Alexander's genius was undeniable, but fortune also played its part. Had Darius chosen to stand in the plains of Syria, where his numbers could spread wide, the outcome might have been different. Had the Persians managed to trap Alexander completely in Cilicia, cutting off his retreat and supply, the Greeks might have been crushed. War is never merely the triumph of strategy, it is the interplay of chance, circumstance, and human will. Had Issus these elements converged in Alexander's favor? Yet history remembers not the possibilities of defeat, but the reality of victory. And so Issus stands, in memory and in myth, as the day a young king with 40,000 men humbled the greatest empire of his time. In the months that followed, Alexander would use his triumph as a lever to pry open the gates of the eastern Mediterranean. Cities fell in succession, some welcoming him as a liberator, others resisting and suffering destruction. The path would lead eventually to Tyre, Gaza, and the wonders of Egypt, where Alexander would be hailed as Pharaoh and son of Amun. Yet through all these campaigns, the shadow of Darius remained. Issus had not ended the Persian king's reign, but it had set the stage for their inevitable confrontation on an even greater field. That confrontation at Gaugamela would surpass even Issus in scale and consequence. But it was at Issus that Alexander first proved to the world, and to himself, that he could stand against the vast machinery of empire and prevail. And so when one considers the significance of Issus, it is not merely the image of spears clashing in a narrow plain that matters, it is the resonance that followed, the shattering of illusions, the rise of legend, the birth of a new order. From that narrow strip of land between mountains and sea, the world was changed. For the Greeks, it was vengeance fulfilled. For the Persians, it was the beginning of a long unraveling. For Alexander, it was the confirmation that destiny was not just a dream whispered by poets and prophets, it was a reality he could seize with his own hands. The smoke of Issus lingered long after the cries of the wounded faded into silence. For Alexander's men, the victory was intoxicating, but also sobering. They had looked into the face of annihilation and survived. They had crossed a river under a storm of arrows, seen their king spear through the Persian left, and watched the great king himself vanish from the field in terror. This was more than a battle won. It was a story to be told to their children, and to their children's children. In the cold nights that followed as the army advanced along the coast, men would whisper to one another about the moment when destiny seemed to step onto the battlefield, walking beside Alexander, as if the gods themselves fought in Macedonian ranks. Yet for Alexander, Issus was not the end but a beginning. Victory had given him momentum, but momentum demanded fuel. His men needed pay, his officers required lands and rewards, and his ambition drove him always forward. The conquest of Asia was no longer an aspiration, it had become a necessity. To turn back after such a triumph would be to betray the image he had built, to appear less a chosen conqueror and more a reckless youth who had gambled and happened to win. And so the march pressed on, the sea ever to their right, the mountains to their left, as they carved their way deeper into lands that had never known submission. For Darius, the loss was not only military but psychological. The great king had been seen to flee before a younger rival, abandoning his own family to captivity. In Persian eyes, this was shame beyond reckoning. The aura of kingship, carefully nurtured through centuries of ritual and ceremony, had been shattered in a single afternoon. He attempted to restore his image with proclamations and promises, vowing to raise yet another army, greater still, to crush the insolent Macedonian. And he did, drawing men from the farthest reaches of his empire, summoning cavalry from the plains of Mesopotamia, war chariots from Babylon, and even war elephants from the east. But the stain of Issus could never be erased. It haunted him like a shadow, a constant reminder that somewhere beyond the horizon marched a king who had bested him once and might do so again. Back in Macedon and Greece, the ripples of Issus reached across the Aegean. News of the battle arrived in triumphal dispatches, each account more dramatic than the last, and poets rushed to set the victory into verse. The Macedonian court presented Alexander not as a mere king, but as a demigod, the living heir of Achilles. Just as Achilles had chased Hector around the walls of Troy, so too had Alexander driven Darius from the field of Issus. The parallels were irresistible, and Alexander himself did little to resist them. He encouraged the association, carrying a copy of Homer into battle, visiting the supposed tomb of Achilles, and shaping his life as if it were a continuation of epic poetry. Issus became his Iliad, the proving ground where legend and reality first intertwined. But beyond myth, the practical consequences of Issus reshaped the Mediterranean. With the Persian army in retreat, the coastal cities of Phoenicia began to reconsider their loyalties. Tyre, Sidon, Byblos, all the jewels of the eastern Mediterranean trade routes, now faced a choice between resisting or embracing the Macedonian tide. Egypt, too, stood vulnerable, its Persian garrisons shaken by the news of their king's defeat. In one victory, Alexander had opened doors that had been sealed for centuries. The balance of power was shifting, and the axis of history itself seemed to tilt in his favor. And yet Issus carried a deeper meaning still. It revealed the fragility of empires, the thin veneer that separated order from collapse. Persia, vast and wealthy, had appeared indomitable, but in a narrow plain where mountains met the sea, all its power had crumbled under the pressure of discipline and daring. The lesson was stark. Size alone does not guarantee survival. It is will, leadership, and vision that decide the course of history. Alexander embodied all three, and Issus proved it to the world. In the decades and centuries that followed, generals and kings would look back to that battle as a study in how audacity can outweigh numbers, how the courage of one man can ripple outward to change the fate of millions. For Alexander's soldiers, the memory of Issus would serve as both a source of pride and a warning. Pride, because they had stood against impossible odds and triumphed. Warning, because they understood that each victory only led to another campaign, another battlefield, another river to cross under fire. Their king was not one to be satisfied. Issus had fed the fire of his ambition, and that fire would burn across deserts, mountains, and plains until it consumed the known world. In time, the story of Issus would be told and retold, each generation shaping it to their own needs. To Romans, it was a tale of courage and strategy, a lesson for their own conquests. To medieval Europeans, it was a vision of Christian virtue triumphing over Eastern despotism. To Persians, it was a painful memory, a scar upon their history that spoke of betrayal and the fallibility of kings. To artists, it became an eternal tableau, the image of Alexander's spear thrust forward, Darius's hand raised in desperation, frozen forever in the moment of decision. And perhaps that is the true legacy of Issus, that it transcended the battle itself. The field where men once clashed has long since grown quiet, the bones of the fallen swallowed by earth, the river's course altered by centuries. Yet the memory endures, carried not by the land, but by the stories we tell. It is in these stories that Alexander rides still, charging into the Persian line, eyes fixed on a destiny only he could see. It is in these stories that Darius flees, a king undone not by the size of his army, but by the failure of his courage. And it is in these stories that we glimpse the eternal truth of history, that moments of decision, brief and violent, can alter the course of civilizations. When we look back upon Issus, we see not only a clash of armies, but a turning point in the great drama of East and West. We see the rise of a figure who would go on to carve his name across continents, whose vision of unity and conquest would outlive him by centuries. We see the fall of an empire that had once seemed unshakable, undone by the very arrogance that had made it strong. And we see ourselves reflected in the timeless questions the battle poses. What drives men to follow a leader into impossible odds? What makes one king flee while another charges forward? And how is it that a single day in a narrow plain by the sea can change the destiny of the world? The answer perhaps lies not in the spears and shields, but in the enduring human desire to reach beyond what is given, to seize what seems unattainable, to believe that destiny can be written not by fate alone, but by courage. At Issus, Alexander wrote such a destiny. He carved it into the memory of nations, and in doing so ensured that his name would outlast empires, kingdoms, and even time itself. The sea still crashes against the shores of Cilicia, the mountains still stand as silent witnesses, but it is the echo of Issus that endures, the echo of 40,000 Greeks who stood against the tide of empire and crushed it, the echo of a young king who looked upon the impossible and made it his own.